And yet, to think carefully, if there is no God, then it means my birth is an accident, my death is an accident, which means the only thing that lies between those two accidents is another accident.
But see, that's
my life.
That's kind of like an emotional appeal too, because no one wants to believe in their life that no one ever wants to believe that that they were born by accident, or that murder might actually not be like immoral or an absolute like evil. You know, it just seems that we want to.
Someone gave me some advice once. There's actually a proverb that says, if you meet the Buddha along the road, kill him. And I mean, to me, that seems to what you're doing here, selling hope. And so, I mean, I think that it is our duty to, question all those supposed proofs and everything. The guy who's trying to sell you the path to enlightenment and truth is the guy you should be most wary of.
I wasn't under the impression that I'm selling anything.
Well, the books. I mean...
The books? What about the books?
I thought they were selling books back there.
Are you guys selling books back there? The books are free.
Oh, okay.
So if you'd like one, go right ahead and take
I
one.
stand corrected.
Why did you jump to that conclusion?
Because I've seen, this is the first instance I've been up here, this is my first year up here, first instance I've seen people promulgating, God and all that, and in Houston, every time I'd see it, they were doing what the girl was actually just talking about here, saying everyone's going to hell, and maybe it was a personal vendetta against people trying to posit their own ideas, and sometimes I see people that are very clever at doing that, and I just want to be able to try to give them a good debate.
Thanks for your honesty.
Because you always ask every time someone gets off, right before they leave, what they live for, and their view. And I believe the whole purpose is, an individual existence, you can't look at it without the context of society. We've always had society, and the whole process, the whole existence, like what our purpose here is what we're doing right now, the collective deliberation. Putting forth, you take your experience, what you learn from life, and you have to bring that to the table. And when people just stand by and let people control the whole situation, that's a lack of living up to your purpose in life.
Which is?
Taking whatever it is you believe, whatever it is you have learned from experience, and coming up and bringing that to the table of society and getting it out there in collective deliberation. Ben Franklin sets up this whole thing beautifully in his autobiography. That's what the whole idea of community is about, is, the self. In the whole thing, he talks about the self, but he never talks about a private self, is because the self that matters is the communal self, what we give to each other and what we can take from each other so we can, better our way of life, how we live, and come to know whatever you may call it, come to communion with God, or an actualization of self, or however Thoreau talks about going out and being aware of the this in tune acuteness to the life and all these different processes and different beliefs, and you have to be able to give everybody an equal share, I guess, and it's living up to your own responsibility, coming up here and putting your own ideas forward and letting them, debate and dance with everybody else's.
Have you found a better way to promote life than what Jesus Christ taught and modeled?
Well, no, but I see that's Jesus Christ's way is one of many, and I mean, it's not necessarily that one is better, objectively. One is only better subjectively in person. Jesus Christ's teachings are better for you, but to a person from a different culture, it may be something completely different. When Emerson talks about the tradition, he frowns upon tradition, saying that we're the present generation being thrown out into masquerade in the clothes of their forefathers is, a wrong view. This tradition is given to us from our, fathers and their fathers before them. It's not, your grandfather's old coat that you're going out masquerade in this negative, imagery that Emerson uses. It's, your father's old jacket that's given down from your grandfather. It's a piece of your own personal history. That's why Christianity works for people who'd had Christianity in their past, whereas Buddhism would maybe work for someone who has more tendencies towards that. It's not that one is above the other. We all see it from different lenses, and whichever one's, coalesces with our experiences and our tradition is the best one.
Whatever coalesces with your tradition?
Yeah, so let's say
Christianity
may work better for certain experiences than Islam. Some people might have grown up under a certain, I don't know the exact experiences, but a person might be, Islam could be more right for one person and help them to reach God than Christianity. But I'm not saying there's a different God, that one is right and one is wrong. They're different paths to the same thing. William Blake says this in his, he has 2 essays, All Religions Are One, and I forget the name of the other, but it's the same idea. It's different paths to the same mountaintop.
So the atheists and I are going to the same top of the same mountain?
Yeah. If that atheist can realize his responsibility to to the humans around him, to life around him, and can work for the betterment of each other, it matters not whether he, praises this name of God or that or the absence of one. As long as he can, effectively relate with other people and help, and we can all better our plot here in the world. Then
what does that
fulfilled.
mean, to better our plot in the world? Who defines what's better?
You do. That's the whole issue of Thoreau, is your idea of the world comes from, you look at yourself and you imagine through an active imagination, you envision the world in which you will flourish, and you work to achieve that end. And that is a responsibility to yourself, to God. That is what you can call the actualization of self, or communion with God, whatever you want, but it's still, same thing.
And what happens if I think that self-actualization is best achieved by having sex with as many good-looking women as I can, by making as much money as I can, by driving as nice a car as I can, and by having as many homes as I can?
Well, I would say if that's what it tells you, then you fulfill that. But common experience tells us, or at least from my viewpoints, to my viewpoints, what I've seen,
your viewpoint,
that doesn't make me happy. I mean,
it makes a lot of others of us very happy.
And immediately, yes, but after long term, that's the whole thing about, hedonism. People always try to condemn hedonism, but I see a really close affinity between hedonism and Epicureanism. But the thing is, if you take it in the temporal context, you're not going to go off and rape women because you like sex, because there's repercussions. You have to take responsibility for your action. Just because something is pleasurable,
what do you mean you have to take responsibility for your action? What does that mean? Why? Why do you have to take responsibility? Why can't you just treat life, if everything's totally relative and if it's just a matter of you creating reality in your own head, why do you have to take responsibility for what you do? You're an accident.
No. All right,
you're not an accident?
Well, all right. First of all, I never said anything about being an accident, but I kind of like the idea of us being an accident. Kierkegaard says that, God never consulted me before he threw me into this thing called existence. It pretty much is kind of an accident. So I'm thrown into it, but I still am confronted with a life that I must deal with. Yeah. And it is my responsibility to try to make sense of it. And that's the whole idea of community.
So make sense of it. And does it make sense that if I want to go and have sex with as many people as I can and make as much money as I can and drive as many expensive cars as I can, you have a problem with that? If that's my reality that I choose to create as the purpose of my life, you have a problem with that?
But the thing is, I know where you're trying to lead with that, but that doesn't.
No. Just answer me, man. Come on, speak to me. Don't give me this garbage about you know where I'm going.
Me one more time.
Just talk to me, man.
There's a difference between just whimsical notions of happiness and your own true will.
Oh, really? What's the difference? And where do you get off telling me that if I want to have sex with as many good-looking women as I can, and I want to drive as many expensive cars as I can, that I'm not being sincere to myself? Where do you get off making that kind of judgment call?
Because I down that path, because I thought the same damn thing, but that doesn't make you truly happy.
Well, how do you know it's going to make me truly happy?
I'm not, but I can say you can go ahead and try, but I know that's not going to do it.
Oh, you do? Well, you are one knowledgeable gentleman. My goodness.
Because I live with a whole bunch of people who think the same thing, and I keep seeing the same thing.
So you've got a bunch of people agreeing with you. Bravo. Does that mean it's true?
No. Agreeing with what you're saying, that they still think that the road to happiness is going out there and f***ing a bunch of women and doing drugs and buying big fancy cars, and they keep ending up unhappy, pissed off about something else or other. So you can say that's what you really want in life, but no, that's not what you really want in life.
Oh, what do I really want in life?
I don't know, but just...
Well, then what do you mean you know that it's not what I really want then?
Because everybody is just going to say, well, pleasure makes me happy, so anything that gives... That's the simple argument. You're trying to take the simple argument. There is a pleasure beyond just the immediate, oh, right now I'm going to this girl and I'm going to be happy forever because I had a pleasurable experience. Even though there are other emotions that may be involved, you might get hurt about something. But you're saying, no, sex makes me happy, so I can go all these women, and that's... No, that's...
According to your worldview, you have no basis to tell me that if I think gassing Jews is the right way for me to experience happiness and to help my culture, my country get better, you have no basis that I've heard yet of telling me, no, that's wrong, that's not right.
The basis I'm using is the whole fact of what I've been arguing is this collective deliberation is a history of things. We have been taught by history that those are wrong things. You keep using examples, gassing Jews. We know through history, we all saw the acts of Hitler. Everybody agrees that that is not a good thing.
You gotta be kidding me. You honestly think everybody agrees that racism and Aryan supremacy is wrong? You honestly believe that?
Okay, no.
Good. Thank you. Have a good afternoon, man.
I just wanted to get your perspective really on maybe the role of shame in the Christian church and if it's used in ways that are maybe counterproductive to what Jesus was actually saying. Sin being just this name for something that we constantly want to rid ourselves of because we want to live and not die, kind of thing. I just wanted to get your opinion on just the concept of sin and how it's used in the Christian church and how it sets someone like me away from the church. And I think it's kind of an issue for me, you know, especially when you hear those guys on the, you know, with the big megaphones telling people and shaming people, saying, you're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell. What do you think about all of that?
If I could murder this woman, bathe my hands in her blood, and feel no guilt, I think that would be really sad, tragic, wrong. So I, for one, am very grateful that God has given us consciences, or just that we have consciences, and we've got out of it at this point, that we have consciences that inform us that murdering people and bathing our hands in their blood is really wrong. I would hate to live in a society where people didn't have a conscience.
Absolutely.
Get me out of that, right?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that, yeah, those things, guilt, shame, conscience, all of that has a place in life. But do you think that in some modern churches, and kind of the mainstream cultural Jesus-type churches, that it's blown out of proportion, that people maybe, you know, like, I found that the church really isn't a place that people can take their biggest and darkest problems anymore. If there was someone that showed up to church and said something along the lines of, you know, like that man, the pornography addict, who couldn't really come to his church and say, I struggle with porn, and I watch it all the time, and it's making me crazy, and I don't know how to stop. And that was something that just became this internal struggle because he was in so much shame about it and didn't really think that the church would understand, you know? And I think that's just kind of sad to me.
Well, the reason I appreciate what you're saying is because I am a minister of a church, one of the pastors of the church in Connecticut. And one of the ways I define the church is Christ's hospital, where broken people like me come for healing. Eugene O'Neill wrote, we're all born broken. Life is about healing. The grace of God is the glue. That's what I need, because I'm born broken. I have a problem with wrongdoing. I do not follow the golden rule perfectly. At times I do follow it, and other times I don't follow it. And I am convinced that it would be wise for me to try and follow it better. And if there is a God in heaven who wants to help me, it would be very wise for me to ask for his help. Now, what Jesus Christ revealed is that there is a God who wants to help me in my brokenness, to give me grace, his love, his power, his guidance, his strength, his wisdom, to grow and to change. So the church is Christ's hospital, where broken people like me come to Christ for healing. Now, as a follower of Christ, do I experience guilt still? Absolutely yes. And I'm glad I do, because I still mishandle people, am rude to people at times, and that's wrong of me. And I experience guilt, but what do I do with that guilt? I don't rationalize it away, and I don't allow it to just pound me into the ground. Oh, you're a loser, you're a loser, you're a loser. Instead, I turn to Jesus Christ, and he promises to forgive me. And so I accept that promise, rejoice in that forgiveness, and then by his grace, with his help, seek to change and become more Christ-like. Obviously, that's going to be a lifelong process for me, because I got plenty of bad habits that are deeply ingrained. See, I'm not like this guy. I am not a guy who just always follows the golden rule. I'm a guy who struggles with superiority feelings at times. You know what I really struggle with? I really struggle with feeling really stung by certain people when they make certain comments to me. And the fact that I feel so deeply stung by their comments shows that there's way too much of my ego hanging around. And that far too much of my self-image is based on what other people think of me. And what Christ calls me to is to base my self-image and my worth on his love for me and the fact that he created me for a purpose, not whether people think I'm great or think I'm a loser. So there are so many examples of how I stray from Christ and stray from what is good. And what sin is it's very destructive. And I've watched that destructiveness take place in my own life, and I've watched it take place in the lives of my family, those who I love most. And so I hate sin. But I'm so grateful that God is gracious and forgives and is in the business of healing broken lives like mine.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because I think that sometimes the role of the church is misinterpreted as this collective group that just keeps eyes on everybody else, which, you know, I think it turns into this legalistic, who can be the best Christian game show type of thing.
Right.
And I definitely got caught up in that. When I was in the Christian church, I was very legalistic, and because I was, you know, didn't do anything wrong ever. But I think that Christian churches sometimes just maybe don't get it, that this is a lifelong process, that there's so much emphasis on the conversion experience as being this end-all be-all, now I'm clean kind of thing, and that you'll never struggle again. And I found that way of thinking just doesn't work. You know, that it's you know, even for me as a non-Christian, you know, I would consider myself an agnostic, you know, but I do have to constantly reach out to something bigger than myself, because I'm stuck. You know, you can't physically move yourself from somewhere. Like, you know, there's just these behaviors that I keep doing, you know, like procrastination for one. I can't stop for the life of me procrastinating. And whatever you want to call that, sin, you know, being lazy, whatever, I had to reach out for that and say, I can't move myself from this position.
Right.
But I wasn't able to quite get there when I was in the Christian church, because I was stuck. And, you know, I think of it in terms of awareness, acceptance, and action. You know, you're aware that something's wrong, maybe you accept it, but, you know, that can also be interpreted as you and God accepting it. But I try to jump from awareness to action and say, God, I'm such a bad person, let me change it. You know, and missing that middle part, you know, of grace, I guess, is what I would call it. But I feel like I'm not making a whole lot of sense, and I have to go to class. But
I think you made a lot of sense, so thank you so much for stopping by.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for being here.
You bet. Have a good afternoon. Because he really exists.
How can you say that he really exists? I mean, I don't see why. Like, you look at yourself, and you said earlier that you look in the mirror and you see yourself as evidence that God exists.
Yes.
You look at humanity and you see the hand of God.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm the opposite of you. When I look at God, I see the hand of humanity, and I don't know if you want me to explain why I feel that way.
Sure.
But, okay. The concept of God as it's constructed by Judeo-Christian philosophy, and really most other religions to a lesser extent, but more Judeo-Christian philosophy, or more the Judeo-Christian God than others, is that it's designed in a way to defy logical argumentation. It's designed to function outside the bounds of logic in such a fashion that you can never disprove it, no matter how many backflips you do. So...
It's not true.
How so? How would
Paul
you
writes in
disprove
1
God?
Corinthians 15, if Christ is not risen from the dead, we're a pack of fools for believing in him.
But that's based on documents that are thousands of years old, of questionable accuracy, and based on, moreover, you have legends that predate that are eerily similar to the same story.
Like which one?
How is that different from the mythos?
Like which one?
I'm afraid I don't have specific
That's
examples.
most
I did the reading
unfortunate.
some a while ago.
Very unfortunate. Because those are clearly shown to not be historical in the slightest. It's simply different mythologies, and when you study the mythologies that most closely parallel the Gospels, guess what? They're AD, not BC.
Really?
Like Mithraism, correct. You study Mithraism, and you begin to realize that the religion that is, quote, supposedly closest to Christianity
Which one is Mithraism? I'm afraid I don't remember
began in
names.
Iraq and Iran,
Okay.
worships and the idea of a being slaughtering a bull, and a lot of Roman soldiers and other military people got into this religion. and there's some parallels. But when you begin to study the parallels and begin to nail it down, you begin to realize those parallels were constructed AD. In fact, 200 AD.
What about all the various other myths that, well, I shouldn't say myths, the various other aspects of Christianity that have been predated to, say, 3000 BC, 2000 BC? For example, the story of the parting of the Red Sea, water from stone, all of those. They all have roots in various pagan mythos that stretches back as far as we can go, basically as far as we can measure. So how can you say that the Bible is more accurate than any of the other mythos that people sincerely believed in for a very long time? Why is the Bible more right?
The Bible is not more accurate historically than the Quran is. The Quran is a very accurate presentation of what Muhammad taught. I can promise you the Bible is not more accurate than the record of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was a real historical person.
Well, I mean, having read several, I've only read one version of the Bible, having read several versions of the Quran, I have to say that I can't agree with you that it's particularly accurate simply because there's so much disagreement between various forms of the Quran that various forms of Muslims believe in, sincerely, on a factual basis. There's a lot of dispute.
Dispute on what?
On interpretations.
Factual information in the Quran.
All right.
Different interpretations, yes.
I'll give you a
But nobody can show that the Quran has not reliably been passed down to us. We have what Muhammad taught, very clearly.
Plus 2 generations of oral tradition, but in which time I'm sure that there was introduced at least some distortion. And then there's mistranslation issues and things like parts of the language dying out over time, then having to be replaced. For example, I don't know if you're familiar with the Syro-Aramaic definitions of terms in Arabic.
No, I'm not.
Well, I'm guessing that everyone here has heard that whole thing about 72 virgins when you die a martyr or whatever, right? I mean, everyone's heard that. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you read it in the context of the passage. It really doesn't make too much sense at all.
Good.
The alternative interpretation is 72 grapes, which were a luxury item at the time. They were a delicacy. It was considered, high luxury to have large amounts of white grapes at your disposal to eat. So that's one of the reinterpretations of it. Now, there's things like that just, that's just one example that I can remember offhand. There are dozens of them. And then there are several disagreements between versions of the faith regarding, various roots of traditions and such.
But that doesn't change the Quran. That's interpretations that conflict. And that's
the stories do change a little bit. It depends on which version you read. They'll change facts. They'll change dates. They'll change times. I don't think it's as reliable a metric as people make it out to be.
The Caliph Uthman hires Zayd bin Thabit to gather all the different versions of the Quran, and he burns them all and has one. There's a tremendous consistency with that one Quran, and there has been for the past 1,500 years.
But what you just said implies that there were other versions flying around.
Yes, we know that.
Even within Uthman was within 2 generations, I'd say that's within 60 years of the Prophet dying. That's correct?
Yeah.
No, I'd say 40. He was alive at the time.
Right.
So within 40 years, you had dozens of different versions of the Quran flying around to the point that you had to burn them. So now why should we believe that even if we assume that there's only one left, right? Let's just assume that they're consistent. Why should we believe that it's not been warped over time? Especially since we don't really have a physical copy that's older than 1300 AD, something like that, which is a full 600 years after.
Good question. And I hope that critical scholarship will continue to question the reliability of the Quran. I think that's a very good point.
So then, by that logic, why should we not continue to question the reliability of the Bible and the Torah and all the other various books that are flying around? And why do we view them as, why would you consider yourself safe viewing them as an immutable, indubitable document?
I'm not asking you to accept them as an immutable document. or infallible or inerrant or anything.
Do you?
I'm simply asking you to accept the Gospels as historically reliable texts.
But that's what you're asking me to do then. You're asking me not to doubt the accuracy of it.
No, I'm asking you to take a hard look at the evidence that points to the historicity, the historical reliability of the Gospels. And for myself, I have used 4 tests to determine historicity of any document. I would encourage you to come up with your own tests that you use to determine historical reliability. Apply them to the Gospels.
What are your 4 tests, if you don't mind my
Internal
asking?
consistency, literary style, archaeological evidence, and manuscript evidence.
Could you explain literary style?
You bet. Once upon a time in the land of Nod, Wynken, Blynken, and Odd took a boat ride. That's fairy tale. At this time, in this place, with these people around, Jesus said this, he did that. It reads like the New York Times. It's eyewitness reportage. Luke chapter 4 used to put me sound asleep until I began to be concerned about this very issue of historical reliability. Luke chapter 3, excuse me. Forgot my good sleeping medicine here. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. Now, to be honest with you, I could care less about who was tetrarch and all the others. And yet, when you take what Luke writes there in Luke chapter 3 and compare it to the Roman record, what becomes apparent is the guy was a meticulous historian. He had his details right.
Okay, if you were to take off the word of God came to X
Yes.
and replace it with whatever else, would you still be inclined to believe it simply because the historical record was consistent? By that I mean specifically the time frame, the names given of the Roman tetrarchs and such. Would you be inclined to believe it?
Well, when after comparing it to the Roman records and seeing that they were right in line, I would say yes, the text is accurate.
Well, what if he said the word of God came to somebody else instead of John?
You know?
Would you believe that?
Well, I would
Let's
read
say
the
it
whole
came to somebody
document.
named Chris.
I would read the whole document, and if it is internally consistent, and if the literary style is historical narrative, and if the archaeological evidence is reliable, and if the manuscript evidence is solid, I'd accept it as historically reliable.
Would you at least agree that that could have been written by anybody with an encyclopedia at the time?
No, because historical fiction was not a literary style used at that point in time, and so that literary style of historical narrative clearly pointed to a claim by the author that this is factual history.
You mean to say that nothing was ever made up at that time in the style of historical fiction, in the style of historical
Narrative? Correct. Historical fiction as a literary style was not invented till hundreds of years after that.
I'm not talking about fiction, pardon me. I'm not talking about fiction. I'm talking about misrepresentation for other ends.
Historical narrative was not used to communicate fiction.
Questions. Where does evil come from?
It comes from a free will deciding to take a good gift that God has given us and twist it and use it in the wrong way.
But doesn't it say in Isaiah that all things come from God, both good and evil? Doesn't it say in Isaiah that earthquakes and deaths and evil come from Him?
No, that the passage about good and evil coming from God, I think if you look at that passage more carefully, it's talking about the judgment of people that you have outlined very accurately.
Well then,
comes from God. God judges evil, and you're right. And the Old Testament gives us a record of how God judged the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Amorites. Yes.
so you're saying the Bible should be taken interpretively or literally?
Sir, every book you and I read, we interpret.
So it should be taken.
The question is, how do you interpret, right? And so I would plead with you, interpret the Bible the same way you interpret any book. Read in context, respect literary style, ask who's the author, what's the audience, what's the intent of the author, who's the audience the author is addressing, and then interpret fairly.
But what about the revelation of Peter, which today is considered apocrypha, except in the Church of Ethiopia, but back then several bishops, it was considered canonical, and several bishops even attested that it was most likely written by Peter himself, in which there is a verse which is actually very much contested among scholars today that says all people will go to heaven. It says in that verse that the people will look down and see the anguish of the sinners and ask God to forgive them, and God will forgive them out of the goodness of his heart. That's what I lost my train of thought here.
All right, that's good. Great point. All right, now, that's why it's important to study. How were the 27 New Testament books put together? Were they put together by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 bishops? Were they put together at a council, like the Council of Nicaea, as Dan Brown argues in the Da Vinci Code? No. The New Testament books were not put together by a council or by a bishop or by a pope. The New Testament was put together by the universal church, and one of the criteria that was used was this book has to be acknowledged universally, not just by a little group of bishops somewhere. It has to be acknowledged universally as reliable and authoritative. Otherwise, it was not included in the New Testament.
What do you mean by universally? There was even
from Rome, Italy, down around to Alexandria, Egypt, the known world.
What about Arianism? That was competing with Catholicism in the beginning of the church. The beginning of the church was not unified; it was split up. You
Right.
had Arianism. So how could you say universally they accepted all that? There were bishops who argued against the revelation because they considered it a mere fairy tale. And it wasn't during the Council of Nicaea that they actually decided what book goes into the Bible and what does not?
Absolutely no way. The Council of Nicaea had nothing to do with determining the New Testament canon. Nothing. The Council of Nicaea was debating over the identity of Christ, the eternal deity of Christ. That was the issue, not the New Testament canon.
If you say universally, but I'm talking about several bishops, several churches, several branches that actually saw the revelation as not part of it. That's not
right.
canonical, and others viewed it. But then how can you say it's universal if you have some churches saying this?
I did not say unanimous.
Or you said universal.
Right.
How can you
meaning by that churches
universal?
around the known world
but not
agreed that this was acceptable, that this came from an apostle or someone who knew an apostle?
But what? Okay, but then I'm talking about Revelation. Some of the churches said no, that's not. They don't view that as canonical. They see that more as a story.
Yes.
While other churches consider Apocalypse of Peter, which says everyone goes to heaven in the end, they consider that as canonical. How can you say it's universal when you have some churches saying no and others saying yes?
The vast majority of churches around the known world at that time rejected the Gospel of Peter, the Apocryphon of Peter, and they accepted revelation of John.
So it's not universal, it's the majority, you mean?
That's what I meant. So I'm sorry for my lack of clarity. It was not unanimous, but it was the universal church, meaning by that the church around the world. It was not the church at Antioch or the church at Rome or the church in Jerusalem. It was from Spain down around to Egypt. There was agreement that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were acceptable, authoritative, reliable, and that the Gospel of Peter was not.
And you said earlier about the parallels between the myths or religions and Jesus, and you asked for an example. What about Zoroastrianism? I can't exactly pronounce
Zoroastrianism, yes?
Yes. That was around 1600 BCE. That was before Christ. That was before Christ ever appeared.
Yeah.
And they spoke, but it has parallels to Christianity. Virgin birth, a good God battling evil.
The idea that there is a force of good and a force of evil is very clear. I think you...
But how can you explain like the parallels between like miraculous healings or a virgin birth in Zoroastrianism with Christianity? How can you explain those parallels?
Well, who's the virgin birth in Zoroastrianism?
Zoroaster, or their prophet. I don't exactly remember his name. I think it's Zoroaster, or I can't exactly pronounce it. He was a prophet, and it was said that he came from a miracle birth, from a virgin mother. It was said that he could do miraculous healings. How can you explain those parallelisms?
Well, sir, just because there are miracles in different religions doesn't mean they're all wrong. Just because there are miracles in different religions doesn't mean that one borrowed from the other. If you believe in a supernatural God, you're open to a miracle taking place, right?
But then you're not exactly taking... what I'm asking is like, if you take into account the proximity, because Zoroastrianism was in the Middle East, near and scholars today are mostly in agreement, or at least they're debating it, that it most likely influenced Islam or Judeo-Christian and Islam. It influenced those religions. So how can you say that Christianity is exactly unique when you see all these parallels with religions before? When you see when scholars today can actually argue that the creation story in the Bible was actually has its roots in Gilgamesh. How you can look at Egyptian religion, the texts of the Egyptian religion, which were thousands of years before Christianity, and had parallels to Jesus' birth and the idea of rebirth and resurrection.
Read the Gilgamesh epic.
I have.
Good. If you conclude that all the Genesis account of the flood is simply a reprint of the Gilgamesh epic, I am dumbfounded. My conclusion would be there really was a great flood, and different cultures tried to explain it in their own language, in their own way. To conclude that there was no flood because we have the Gilgamesh epic and the Genesis account of the flood, I think is unwarranted.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying
What are
that
you saying?
I'm asking how you can call Christianity unique, how you can...
Oh, it's very simple.
How you can
because
ignore
Jesus
it.
was an historical person who lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead, and nobody else has risen from the dead historically the way he has.
But then Zoroaster has historical perspectives in that case as well. You have no historical proof outside the Bible. Outside of the Bible, there really isn't
So
much
what?
historical proof of Jesus. You're using one text.
No. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, James, Paul, many different individuals. The New Testament is not written by one person.
But those books were written, I believe, around 6 years after Jesus' death. How exactly can you explain that gap? Like, what exactly happened?
All right. Go right back to the book of Acts, 50 days after the resurrection of Christ. Peter stands up on the street of Jerusalem and says, "You killed the Christ, God raised him from the dead." And people didn't stand there saying, "No, this Christ never existed. No, this Christ never died on a cross." They didn't even say, "No, this Christ didn't rise from the dead."
But you don't have any proof except outside the Bible. You don't have any third-person accounts talking anything about Jesus rising from the dead or Paul doing that. In most of the accounts, in most of the other accounts, speak of the Christians as a group. You don't see anything. You don't see any text actually saying Jesus or actually being historical.
You think so? Well, then you need to read
Most of-
Josephus, the Jewish historian. He writes about Jesus as an historical person. You need to read the Mishnah.
Doesn't he write it from a third perspective?
You need to read the Mishnah, which is the Jewish commentary on the Torah, which includes very hostile references to Jesus as a magician, as a false prophet. You need to read some of the writings of the Romans who talk about Jesus and followers of this Christ figure as a real person. So there are other documents outside the New Testament Gospels that talk about Jesus as being a real historical person.
I myself accept that Jesus may have been a real person, but you don't really have any text talking about the miracles he does. You don't have any outside text saying he resurrected.
Okay, so is that what you need to believe in Jesus?
If one of the main tenets of Christianity is he rose from the dead so that I may be forgiven, then yes, because if there's no actual proof outside of the Bible, outside of the sacred text that he rose from the dead, how can you exactly count it to be true? It would be the same as saying Muhammad really went to heaven, according to the Quran.
So what you're asking for is someone who saw Jesus risen from the dead, did not believe in him, and wrote about it.
Did not believe in him, but at least wrote it outside of the Bible, wrote it as a third person.
We've just been talking about how the Bible wasn't put together until, the 300s. So there were many independent authors who wrote about this Jesus having died and risen from the dead.
But then
you
where
have
are they?
independent attestation.
Where are those independent attestations?
Matthew, Mark,
Besides
Luke.
those books.
Well, what prejudice do you have against those books? They're different, unique books.
They're all in the Bible.
Well, that wasn't till the 300s.
I'm asking. In the 300s.
When they were first written, they weren't together. You had this document Matthew, you had this document Mark, you had this document Luke, you had this document John, you had this document Romans, and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. They weren't all in one book. They're different documents. That's exciting. It's fantastic. It's exactly what you're looking for.
What exactly would you characterize sin? What is sin exactly?
You bet. Sin is playing God.
Playing God?
Playing God.
It would not.
Sin is breaking God's moral absolutes.
So breaking his laws.
Sin is not loving God and not loving people. Hating God, hating people, being indifferent to God, being indifferent to people, that is sin.
But
The heart of sin is idolatry. The heart of sin is taking something good or something that's not very good and turning it into the ultimate. For instance, money is good. But to take something good like money and turn it into the ultimate, the reason that I live, that's idolatry. Sin is taking something good, like my mind, a gift from God, making it into the ultimate, being a rationalist and living for my reason. Sin is taking something good, my sexuality, and turning it into the ultimate, living for pleasure, for sexual pleasure. That's hedonism. Those are all different examples of sin. Taking something that could be good or not so good, turning it into the ultimate, and then living for that, instead of living for God and living for people.
so sin wouldn't exactly be disobeying God's laws.
Yeah, sin is disobeying God's laws.
But
Because part of God's laws is, I'm to worship God, I'm not to worship the creation. I'm to worship the Creator, not the creation.
okay, but if you break one of God's laws, would that be considered sin?
Yeah.
But
Because if I break one of God's laws, what I'm saying is, God, I have a better idea on how to live my life than you do.
But God says in the Old Testament, do not kill. But you see him commanding his followers to kill. You see.
No, the
how would you
commandment is do not
characterize that?
murder. The commandment is not do not kill. It's murder.
Okay.
And God doesn't murder,
Okay.
and if any follower of Christ murders, that's sin. But I can promise you, if I and another follower of Christ walk into McDonald's, and there's a guy spraying machine gun bullets into little kids' bodies, and if I hit the guy high, and my Christian friend hits the guy low, and we break his neck in the process and kill him, that is not murder, sir.
Okay, so-
that is killing motivated by a drive to preserve the innocent from being slaughtered. That's ethically different from murder. Murder is me killing someone because of selfishness, hatred, or revenge.
Okay, well then that proves my point when he tells them to kill the women and children to drive out the Canaanites. Killing them, isn't that ethically wrong?
Okay, you're thinking well, good point. No, when God chooses to judge a nation, a people group, innocent people get swept up in that judgment.
So as long as God says that genocide and Holocaust is okay.
No,
But that's
God
not
is
exactly
choosing
what he
to
said.
judge people groups for what they did wrong. And because we're more interconnected than we would like to admit, innocent people were swept along in the judgment.
He, for what they
He
did.
did not
You mean
hire a
living-
guy to go in there and just wipe out evil adults.
You mean living? You mean by being wrong or doing wrong? You mean by living in a certain area and having a different belief and culture as theirs?
If you do evil, I don't care
He
what
tells-
culture you're in,
he
you are
tells-
responsible to God for that evil, and He will hold you accountable.
He tells the Israelites to kill men, women, children, to commit murder to the women and children because he says because they have different beliefs than you, because you must
No,
drive
it is
them out.
not because they have different beliefs. False.
He says because they have
It is
false gods.
because they have done evil. They have sacrificed their babies on altars, calling that an act of worship. They have taught people that the way to know God is to have sex with a temple prostitute. And God judged those cultures for the slaughter, the way they slaughtered their innocent children, and for the way they taught people that the way to know God was to have sex with a temple prostitute.
Isn't that intolerant of their culture? That's their.
No,
You have
it's intolerant of evil.
You have cultures today that have headhunting, where the only way to become a man is to kill another man.
That's evil.
That's intolerant of their culture. That's basically saying no because according to my culture, my religion, that's wrong. Isn't that being intolerant?
I can promise you that if you rescue a fellow Homo sapien from being cannibalized by a headhunter, that is good. And if you go into that situation and say, I'm sorry, it's all relative, and if this group of men wants to eat this guy's head, go right ahead. It's just fine because it's your culture.
But no,
that's
but
very
because
sad.
But that's because it's my own culture. My own culture is not to see that, which means as following my own culture, I should stop that. But I'm still pointing out, like, you're saying God is saying to be tolerant when He shows in the Old Testament to be very, very intolerant of other people. When He tells them if they curse God, kill them. If they don't believe in God, kill them.
Killing Jews came from eugenics, from social Darwinism that teaches that some people are a superior level of the evolutionary cycle, and these Jews and gypsies and homosexuals are an inferior level of the evolutionary cycle. Therefore, to help Nazi Germany move forward, we need to execute homosexuals, gypsies, and Jews. That is the philosophical basis for the Holocaust.
Darwinism came around the early 1900s, late 1800s, I believe.
1859, Darwin wrote Origin of the Species.
Yes, so socialists. But you had anti-Semitism before Darwin. You had anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages.
Absolutely. You had anti-Semitism in the first century.
One of the ideas of anti-Semitism was that they killed Jesus.
Agreed. We agree. Obviously, there's been too much anti-Semitism that has been fueled by an idea that the Jews killed Christ, so we're going to go after the Jews. But I can promise you, that is not what fueled the Nazi Holocaust. When you study Nazism and Hitler, what fueled the Nazi Holocaust was eugenics, racial superiority. Why? Because the clear belief was evolution.
Because
we have evolved to higher levels. And the clear Nazi teaching was blacks, Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals, and handicapped people are inferior levels of the evolutionary cycle. That is the justification for wiping them out.
they saw that, except going back to right and wrong being relative, they saw that as right. If Nazis controlled the world today, that would be right.
And they would be wrong, I'm convinced. What about you? Do you think they'd be wrong or not?
That would be relativism.
No. Well, yeah, what you're espousing is relativism.
If the Nazis control the world today,
right,
killing Jews, blacks, anyone non-Aryan or
non-Aryan,
that would be considered right. That would be considered culturally right, and they would see it as fact.
And I would contradict it. And I would hope you'd contradict it. Not because we're enlightened Westerners, but because we have consciences and rational minds that enable us to understand that that is absolutely wrong. I don't care how many people say it's right. I don't care whether my culture says it's right or not.
But then it's relative. It's coming from your own subjective viewpoint.
No, it's coming from a conviction that the human conscience enables us to tie into an objective moral.
We need these messiahs, we need these legends in order to live our own lives.
Really?
And yeah. Like, you were asking Kevin earlier, like, what motivates you? We need, if you don't have anything that's motivating you, then yeah, you would kill yourself. Sort of, maybe. Yeah. I don't know what I'm going at. But what I'm basically trying to say is that everyone needs a motivator, and it kind of seems as human nature to, if it actually doesn't exist, if the complete truth is that there isn't, that we make it up.
Okay. And yet, to think carefully, if there is no God, then it means my birth is an accident, my death is an accident, which means the only thing that lies between those two accidents is another accident.
But see, that's
my life.
That's kind of like an emotional appeal too, because no one wants to believe in their life no one ever wants to believe that that they were born by accident, or that murder might actually not be immoral or an absolute evil. It just seems that we want to believe that, so we rationalize that. That's the number one. That's one of the greatest traits of humankind. We can rationalize basically anything.
Okay. When I tell you that if it's true that my birth is an accident and my death is an accident, that it follows that the only thing between those two accidents is another accident, my life. I'm not appealing to your emotions, I'm appealing to your mind.
No, but that
Think
sucks.
reasonably.
Who here wants that to happen? Who here wants that's the final answer, that we're all an accident?
All right,
That
Max.
doesn't necessarily mean it's true, not true.
Good. And guess what, Max? In order to graduate from this place, you're going to have to study. And that sucks. But sir, that's part of growing up, right? That's part of maturing and getting in touch with reality. So, if it's true that my birth is an accident and my death is an accident, I better grow up and face that reality that life is absurd. It's just an accident. And if that's true, I got to grow up, and although I don't like it, I better accept it because it's true.
Well, the weird thing is, I mean, like, if that is true, I wouldn't want to believe that.
Why
and
not?
I would want to make up a God.
So you do believe in God?
No, I'm saying I want to believe in God. I don't believe in God, but I want to believe in
Then
God.
why don't you believe in God?
Because it's just so hard to with the lack of, you know, I'm just so weary.
With the lack of evidence?
I was gonna say evidence. Too big a buzzword. But yeah, it's just so hard to like comprehend that. Because I mean, it's just, you know, it's impossible to argue that, you know, that the life of a believer is like, I mean, I think, you know, anyone here could say that the life of a believer is more comfortable than the life of a non-believer. Because that is such a horrible truth, you know, that we're here by accident.
Okay, C.S. Lewis
But that
disagrees
doesn't
with
necessarily mean it's not true.
me. See, C.S. Lewis did not want there to be a God. And I understand why. I have a good buddy who went to Harvard, and he goes to the church now in Connecticut that I pastor. And he sat with me and said, Cliff, when I got to Harvard, I wanted to live a certain lifestyle. The problem is that the lifestyle that I wanted to live made me feel guilty. So I had to figure out a way to deal with my guilt. Very simple. I became an atheist. Because you see, if there is no God, guilt is fantasy. Nothing to feel guilty about. Just do whatever.
But that's the other end of the emotional appeal, though, side. He's using atheism as a way to rationalize his bad behavior.
Good.
But
So we better be very careful about our emotions, and we better be as objective as we're able to and really analyze the situation, right?
But God appeals to the other side of the coin, to someone like Mother Teresa who's doing so much good in the world and saying, like, what for?
Well, remember, Mother Teresa really struggled with doubt. She was very honest about that in her diaries, right?
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, you know, everyone who does good in the world wants to be rewarded for it. And God is a very convenient, perfect answer for that. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true,
Correct.
You're saying, but
I mean, it's true.
God is awesome.
Yeah, I agree with that. He is
It's like
awesome.
it explains everything. Like, you don't know something,
No.
God did it.
No, it doesn't explain everything. There are a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of mysteries for me as a follower of Christ. I don't have the answers to all the questions, that's for sure. I do not know is one of my favorite answers, because it's the truth. I don't know why God allowed suffering. I don't know why God didn't have Hitler's mother have a miscarriage. Would have been rather convenient. Okay, so there are lots of things I don't know. The question is, what does the evidence point to? And clearly, Max, if you look at the options, and that's what I did with your fellow student Kevin before.
Yeah.
Remember, I can't have certainty, positive, about anything in life. Everything is vague to one extent, but that doesn't mean I can't know. Do you think I can prove my wife?
No, I think that's
Good.
exactly it, though. It's just not. It's not that there's evidence. It's just that I don't know yet. I don't know yet, and eventually we will know.
We will know? Not if atheism is true. If atheism is true, we don't know nothing.
20 years
100
ago,
years
we didn't
from
know
now.
a lot that we know now.
Yeah, but if
Just to
atheism is
basically-
true, we're all going to die and become fertilizer, so we don't know nothing. Right? We're dead and we become fertilizer. So we're not going to find out. If atheism is true, I'm never going to find out that that's true, because when we all die, we all become extinct. Right? But if Jesus Christ is the truth, then all of us, atheist, agnostic, Christian, are going to find out whether it's true or not.
That's an unfair advantage you have in this debate.
It's a point I just realized a little while ago.
Yeah, I only have 40 years.
You know, if the atheist is correct, we're never going to find that out. We're all going to die and become fertilizer. If the follower of Christ is correct, we're all going to stand before Christ one day and find out that indeed he is true. See, that motivated Blaise Pascal to come up with a wager. And in light of that fact, don't you think you'd be wiser to really check out Christ?
But the wager is a classic example of logical fallacy. Isn't the wager, if I'm correct, is that the one, like the thought problem of, like there's two options. You can either believe in God or not believe in God.
Yep.
And if you don't believe in God,
Right?
and there's a God, you go to hell. But
Right.
if you do and there's not, then so what?
Yeah.
But if you do and there is a God, you get to go to heaven. Yay. I mean, that just seems such like a grab almost.
Yeah. Until you study Pascal's life. Pascal was a brilliant scientist, brilliant, way ahead of his time. He was also into gambling. That was a rather popular activity in his day, to gamble. So it's coming out of that experience of being both a scientist
So he believes
and
in
a
God
gambler.
it seems that he believes in God out of a gamble. Like that's the best possible choice for him.
No, he was a brilliant scientist. You see, what Pascal would be saying to you today, right now, I'm convinced is, Max, because the stakes are so high in what we're talking about right now, you better go back and study this really carefully. Because if there is a God and if Jesus Christ is the truth, the consequences last for eternity. But if there is no God, there are no real consequences.
But that's a big,
that separate
that's a
us.
huge if, and kind of like an unfair decision for me to make.
Unfair decision?
For like to think in that sort of way, to
Oh no, Max.
to make life choices not based on what's right and what's wrong. I mean, like what's fact and what's fiction.
Well, that's why I said you
based
got to
on
go
what's
back
the
and
best
study.
for your-
No, you got to go back and study. Max, have you studied the Gospels?
A little bit.
Okay.
I've been to a few youth groups and whatnot.
Good.
and
All right. Now,
once in a while.
Max, the issue is so important, no longer is a little bit acceptable. Because the issue is so significant, Max, you really got to study this thing and put it to bed.